everybody! Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive video slash series. This story that we're talking about today, it was supposed to be a strange and unusual video because trust me, it is strange and it is unusual. But then, as I began researching, creating an outline, I was like, holy shit, right? This goes deep. This goes deep. There's a lot of moving, interconnected pieces, a lot of really interesting and contextual information hiding just under the surface and sometimes not really under the surface, right out in the open. And I owe it to this story and to you guys to let it be what it needs to be. And I need to tell it all to you in the three-dimensional and intricate way it deserves to be told, with all of the history and all of the mystery that truly brings it to life. Because I went deep here. That's what took me so long to get back to you guys. I went deep. I was brought to places I didn't expect to go, and I learned things I didn't expect to learn. And I want to share it all with you. Today, we are talking about the disappearance and presumed death of Michael Rockefeller. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it should. Michael was an heir to the Rockefeller family fortune, and as we know, it was and still is quite a fortune. He was on the fast track to follow in the footsteps of his father and his father's father when he suddenly vanished while in Papua New Guinea. Over the years, there have been many theories, but in this series of videos, we're going to go over everything from start to finish and then focus on the three most prominent theories. I will say, when I first started looking into this, I was surprised because before it came onto my radar, I'd never really heard about Michael Rockefeller's disappearance before. It just wasn't really talked about a lot. And in my opinion, there's a lot of reasons for that. And we'll get into those reasons as well and kind of what those reasons are. But before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Native. I mean, you already know, I love Native and I love their products so much. I use their deodorant and body wash every single day and every single night, and I have for over 2 years, and I never want to use a different body wash or a different deodorant, and that is a fact. And there really is so much to love about Native. Native's deodorants are made with familiar and simple ingredients that you know and love, such as coconut oil and shea butter. They're aluminum-free, paraben-free, cruelty-free, and vegan. And the great thing about Native's deodorants is the texture is smooth, non-sticky, they don't crumble, and they dry really fast. But best of all, they keep me smelling sweet all day long with 72-hour protection, even after a full day of moving around, exercising, and sweating my butt off in this heat wave that has seemed to have swept the land. And they have a wide range of scents that are simple and effective. They're always adding new and limited edition scents as well. Right now, Native has their summer seasonal scents out, serving up the perfect summer day with their limited edition cocktail-inspired collection. Think pina colada, lakeside ginger mule, and poolside citrus spritz. I've been using citrus spritz in the body wash, and I can't explain what about the scent draws me, because it's very, citrusy smelling, but really clean smelling at the same time. It's unlike any other scent I've ever smelled, which is par for the course for Native. All of their scents are amazing and very unique. I also didn't think I was going to like the pina colada smell because I usually don't like coconut in body wash and deodorants and products and stuff because it always ends up smelling so fake and overpowering. But Native's pina colada scent is the perfect balance of fruity pineapple and nutty coconut. It's not fake smelling at all. It smells so good. And I'm really mad that I didn't see the ginger mule scent before I ordered it, because if you didn't know, even though I talk about it all the time, I love ginger so much. I love the smell of it, and I want that scent now, so I have to put in another order ASAP. Native also offers a plastic-free version of their deodorant, which is, using the same great formula inside, but a more sustainable packaging outside. It's earth-friendly and 100% plastic-free. And we have talked about Native's other products. Their toothpaste is amazing. My husband loves it, but my one true love will always be the body wash. It's so good. It leaves me and my whole bathroom smelling like a spa day. They suds up beautifully, but they're not drying on the skin, and the fresh and clean scent lingers with me. I'm always getting compliments about it. Now, 3 deodorants are usually $39, but if you click on my link in the description box and use code StephanieH21, you get them for $26. That's over 33% off. Once again, click on the link in the description box and use code StephanieH21. With that same code, you can also get 20% off any body wash or toothpaste. And you know I'm using my own code to stock up on these body washes, man. Just really good products, really great scents. I love everything about Native. So thank you so much to Native for sponsoring this video. Let's dive into today's video. Man, it feels like so long since I've sat here and talked to you guys and hung out with you guys. I am so happy to be back. I'm feeling a little tired. You know, I got back from London about a week ago where I was for CrimeCon UK. That was a whirlwind. It was so many things happened. Such an amazing experience, such a strange experience in some ways. I would make a video about it and talk to you guys about London if you want. So let me know in the comment section if you want a video about London because, wow, so much happened. Anyways, let me know, but it feels so good to be sitting back here in my little recording booth and talking to you guys again. I missed you so much. I mean that truly from the bottom of my heart. I missed sitting here recording a video for you guys. I missed talking to you guys. I missed interacting with you in the comments. I haven't really been on social media a lot because when I got back from London, obviously I was already behind and I wanted to bring you this video, which turned into videos, which as you know, I wasn't expecting it to become 3 videos. I just thought it was going to be 1. And then, you know, it took on a life of its own and it took me longer to kind of complete than I thought. So I'm really happy to be back here now with you guys. Thank you so much for being patient with me. Thank you so much for giving me the grace that most of you always do. I appreciate you from the bottom of my heart. And I know I do not tell you that enough, as I do not tell most of the people in my life enough how much I appreciate them, how much I love them, how much they truly are my rock. But I truly do want you guys all to know how much I really do appreciate you and how much I really do care for you and how much you know, how much of an integral part of my life you've all become and how weird it is when I'm not really actively putting out content because then I'm not really actively interacting with all of you. And it's weird because you have become such a big part of my life and I just missed you guys. It's so weird. I'm not used to being like emotional or like talking about my feelings. It's just not something that comes supernaturally to me. But let's talk about what does come supernaturally to me. Oh, let's talk about what does come naturally to me. And that is talking to you guys about this stuff that I research. And I'm going to really just give a quick disclaimer. There is so much, and that's why I don't understand how I could have put this in one video, but there's so much that surrounds this story, this time period in history, in culture and society. There's no possible way I could fit it all, even into 3 videos. So there's going to be certain areas where I sort of skirt over things or I compile and condense things into more digestible sorts of segments. There's no possible way I could go into depth in every little piece of history, every little piece of culture, every little piece of everything that really is involved in this. And that's not because I don't want to. That's because it would be a 15-part video. And most people would be like, okay, we're all set now. Like you're going too hard. You're too extra. Enough. I know there's a good amount of you who would be there with me through all 15 parts, but a lot of you would not be. And I just want to try to keep everybody happy. So just keep that in mind. You can absolutely, if you know about this time in history, if you know about this culture, things like that, put whatever you know into the comment section because this is a hive mind. We all want to learn from each other, but don't say, oh, you forgot this or you forgot this. You should have talked about this because I have to, edit and I have to make decisions and I'm not doing it purposely. I'm not doing it out of ignorance. I'm not doing it because I'm trying to shine more light on this or less light on this. It's just what did we need to progress with the story and how could I present it to you in the best way where it supported this story but didn't go too far off the beaten path, even though it is my nature to go real far off the beaten path. So without further ado, let's jump in. Michael Clark Rockefeller was born on May 18th, 1938, into a family that has been considered American royalty. The Rockefellers are an American industrial, political, and banking family that holds one of the world's largest fortunes, and they've been incredibly powerful and influential since the late 19th century when John D. Rockefeller, high school dropout and the son of a traveling salesman, founded the Standard Oil Company, which would eventually earn him the title of America's first billionaire. His grandson and Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, was a character in his own right. Born a Rockefeller scion on July 9, 1908, the same day as his illustrious grandfather, certain things were expected of young Nelson. Yes, he was the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, but he was also the grandson of the powerful United States Senator Nelson Aldrich. And with both business and politics in his blood, he would go on to be incredibly prominent in both. He was what you might call a career politician, acting as the Assistant Secretary of State for American Republic Affairs, as well as the Undersecretary of Health, Education, and Welfare before becoming the governor of New York State, a position he held from 1959 to 1973, which is a long time to be governor, but reportedly he was quite good at his job, and I'm sure he served himself, as most politicians do, but it seemed, especially early on, he also served the people through several public works initiatives such as building low-income housing, schools, hospitals, and creating the state university system, which those of us who live in New York know as SUNY, S-U-N-Y. And, he made some bad calls in his position as governor as well, as he would spend more and more time amongst the ranks of the political elite. I truly believe that many people do go into politics with the best intentions, but once they're in it for a few years, it hardens them and spoils them and corrupts them from the inside out. So Nelson's involvement in suppressing the Attica prison riot of 1971, for example, his harsh drug laws that carried lengthy prison sentences, the way he spent taxpayer money very liberally, these things brought Nelson Rockefeller a lot of criticism and turned some people away from him. But this did not stop him from becoming vice president of the United States from 1974 to 1977 under President Gerald Ford.
Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
The duties of the office.
The duties of the office.
On which I am about to enter.
On which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Nelson and his first wife, Mary Clark Rockefeller, would have 5 children together. Rodman, born in 1932, Anne, born a few years later, Stephen, born in 1936, and then 2 years later, a set of twins who would become the babies of the family, Mary and her twin brother, Michael. Now, when Michael was born, the Rockefeller family fortune was estimated to be roughly $900 million. And I would tell you how much money that is in today's dollars, but it's really too much money to even say with a straight face. It's ludicrous. What I will say to put things into perspective for you is that $900 in 1937 would be equivalent to almost $18,000 today. Damn. So obviously, young Michael Rockefeller, he was going to have the best of everything, and he was going to be presented with every possible opportunity that wealth and power can afford, which pretty much meant the sky was the limit. He attended the Buckley School, a private boys' elementary school on East 74th Street in New York City. From there, he went on to Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire for high school, where he was a student senator, a talented varsity wrestler, and the art director of the yearbook. So let's pause here and examine what I just said because it's important. Varsity wrestler, student senator, and art director of the yearbook. These 3 things are very different, right? You've got politics, athletics, and the arts. And you may feel that this means Michael was a very well-rounded young man. But in my opinion, from what I now know, it feels like a lot Michael did in his life was done because he felt it was expected of him. He may have acted as a student senator to appease his father. He may have been on the wrestling team because he enjoyed it, but he became the art editor of the yearbook because that was what he really loved. That was his passion. art, creativity, stepping outside the box of everything that had sort of been laid out for him. After high school, Michael attended Harvard University, graduating cum laude with a degree in history and economics. After college, Michael served for 6 months in the United States Army, but that was not his destiny. And destiny was a concept that Michael's father, Nelson, believed in heavily. Michael knew that his own destiny was pretty much already laid out for him. And so before he settled into a life that had been planned out for him since before he was born, he wanted to embark on a great adventure, something that would bring him as far away from the wealth and opulence that he had grown up around as humanly possible. And luckily for him, Rockefellers were expected to make connections with those from other cultures and other areas of the world. Now, of course, those relationships, those connections, they were intended to be built with people who were at the highest levels of power and influence. So other countries, other cultures, but important people, right? Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, he traveled all over the world to meet with foreign dignitaries and things like that. He met with Gandhi, and he actually went to Sumatra in Indonesia, where he purchased a knife featuring a sculpted head adorned with real human hair. And this sparked his interest in primitive art. Now, at that time, Nelson Rockefeller was already a prolific collector of art and was described as having an insatiable appetite for it. The founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, Alfred Barr Jr., once said, quote, "Nelson needs art more than any man I know." End quote. Nelson had been greatly influenced by his forefathers, but it was his mother, a woman he often called a free spirit, who taught him to love art. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller founded the Museum of Modern Art in New York City in 1929, and many of us here in New York know the Museum of Modern Art as MoMA, so I'll be referring to it as MoMA from now on. And later, when she was asked what had given her the idea to create this museum in a time where women really weren't known to be doing such things, she said, quote, "I began to think of women I knew in New York City who cared deeply for beauty and who bought pictures, women who would be willing and had faith enough to help start a museum of contemporary art." End quote. But Abby also saw the museum as a way to foster her son Nelson's interest in art, in being a patron of the arts, donating to the arts, and collecting art. And so he became MoMA's first president in 1939, the same year he purchased this prized knife in Sumatra. Now, being president did not give Nelson carte blanche over the way the museum was run, however, because he tried to convince the trustees to include an exhibit of primitive art. And they were not enthused with the idea, and they declined. They were like, listen, this is the Museum of Modern Art, so no, we don't want primitive art in the museum. They were far less impressed with primitive art than Nelson himself was. So when I say primitive art, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, in Nelson Rockefeller's time, primitive art would have been considered the oldest form of artwork known to man, except the people who were making this art, or what Nelson and, modern societies would consider art, they didn't really think that they were making art, and they didn't consider themselves to be artists. It describes the artifacts and items of certain groups of people who were considered to be outside the spheres of influence of other dominant cultural groups like Western society. So objects from tribal societies such as Sub-Saharan Africa, the Pacific Islands, native groups throughout America. But really understand that the word primitive is a very colonial Western term. The people who were creating this stuff didn't consider themselves to be primitive, and what they were creating was not art to be put into a museum and enjoyed. They were important things to their day-to-day life, to their culture, to their spirituality. And then, the Western world came in and they were like, this stuff's cool. This spear is cool. This tribal mask is cool. Let's put it on a wall so everybody can enjoy it because we think it looks cool. And I'm not giving my opinion on whether that is right or wrong because honestly, I myself don't really know how I feel about it yet. So Nelson Rockefeller wants to do a primitive art exhibit And Moma says no. And Nelson, who was not used to being told no, and who basically had enough money to do whatever he wanted anyways, he continued to travel around the world, collecting things from every place he visited. He would later say, quote, "I started to see art as widely varying expressions of individuals from all parts of the world and from all ages, with strong feelings and great creative capacities to express their feelings. No longer was my appreciation confined to classical forms of art as taught in our schools and shown in great museums," end quote. So he's expanding his idea of what's considered beautiful, what's considered to be art. In 1954, Nelson Rockefeller founded the Museum of Indigenous Art, located in a townhouse on West 54th Street that was adjoined to the home he had grown up in. It was also located directly across the street from MoMA, and maybe that was a bit intentional, because at this point, he was no longer the president of that museum. Maybe he was like, hey guys, I'm over here with my cooler art, with my cutting edge art, with my, progressive art, because Nelson Rockefeller was known to be quite progressive, especially for a Republican. In December of 1954, the New York Times reported, quote, "The collection amassed by Mr. Rockefeller over the last decade from the Americas, Africa, Oceania, Asia, and Europe is scattered at various points. It will be brought together for the first time late next year when the galleries will be opened," end quote. 10 years after the Museum of Indigenous Art revealed its exotic and extensive pieces, mainly from Nelson Rockefeller's own collection of things that he picked up in his travels, he told an interviewer, quote, "My interest in primitive art is not an intellectual one. It is strictly aesthetic. Don't ask me whether this bowl I'm holding is a household implement or a ritual vessel. I could not care less. I enjoy the form, the color, the texture, the shape. I'm not in the least interested in the anthropological or the ethnological end of it. That is why I founded the museum, to show that the art of primitive people could be treated on purely aesthetic and formal grounds," end quote. And maybe, just maybe, that was where things had gone wrong. Maybe Nelson Rockefeller had taught his son Michael, yes, to be interested in other cultures, to be drawn to them, to find them beautiful, maybe even to love them. But he may not have taught Michael that it was more important initially to understand them and to deeply respect them. It's fine to find artifacts and art from other cultures aesthetically pleasing, but even though Nelson Rockefeller may not have cared whether a thing was a bowl or a ritual vessel, the culture that created that thing, they did care very much. To put it into some perspective, in 2022, and it's hard because I'm trying to think of what people generally find to be important in 2022, what people believe deeply and heavily in 2022. But let's say you're a deeply religious person in 2022, a Christian person, and some alien race suddenly shows up at your doorstep and they walk into your house and they see your Bible and they take it back to their distant land. And then they hold your Bible up and they say, I don't care if this is some religious book or if it's a book of bread recipes. I think it looks cool. It's awesome. Don't you think? You see what I mean? Nelson Rockefeller may not have cared. The people going to see these museum exhibits may not have cared. But the people of the culture who made the object, they cared very much. When the Museum of Primitive Art opened its doors, Michael Rockefeller was just 19 years old, and he was still in that very tricky time of life where you're planning to forge your own path and be your own person, but annoyingly enough, you still desperately crave acceptance from your parents. You still want to show them that you can make them proud. Michael would have been well aware of how important primitive art was to his father, and maybe he saw this as a path for him to go out and explore the world while still contributing to the Rockefeller legacy. So Michael and his best friend from Exeter, Sam Putnam, they would always talk about going out and doing something remarkable and having this one last big adventure before they settled into their expected life paths. Sam as a doctor and Michael as a Rockefeller son. Now, Sam Putnam, knowing Michael's, desire to have this adventure, he introduced him to a man named Robert Gardner, who ran the Harvard Film Study Center and who was in the planning stages of making a documentary film about a virtually uncontacted group of Neolithic peoples in Papua New Guinea called the Dani tribe. Now, I have to give some historical background on New Guinea because it's going to be really important as we go through the rest of this story. New Guinea is an island in the Malay Archipelago, the largest group of islands in the world, and New Guinea is actually the second largest island in the world. Now, we know this area as Indonesia, but it wasn't always called that. It's believed that the first inhabitants of the island migrated there from Southeast Asia 50 to 60,000 years ago, making it one of the first land masses after Africa and Eurasia to be populated by humans. As I said, this is a very big island, and it's very wild, even to this day. About 70% of New Guinea is covered by rainforest, and it's been inhabited for a very long time. This means that much of the rest of the world, they began sailing off, discovering each other, trading with each other, fighting with each other, and conquering each other. But this area was virtually untouched and unknown because it was so wild. And therefore, the people who lived there went on as they had for thousands of years. The outside world not knowing they existed, and the people in New Guinea themselves not knowing the outside world existed. When you really think about that, it's very cool. Now, it's believed that Portuguese and Spanish navigators sailing in the South Pacific in the early 16th century were the first Europeans to even lay eyes on Papua New Guinea, and surprisingly, the people there were still left alone for almost another 200 years. But in 1883, the island was invaded by the West. The Dutch took the western half as part of their East Indies Empire, and the Germans and the British claimed the eastern half, dividing it between them. There's a lot more to this, such as Australia's role in all of this, but we would be here for 7 hours if I went into it. Like I said, we can't touch on everything. And what we're going to mainly focus on in this video, and the ones that follow, is the Dutch area of New Guinea. The Dani tribe that Robert Gardner was interested in, they are from the central highlands of western New Guinea in the Baliem Valley, which is a very remote and hard-to-reach area. The valley is located high up in the mountains, 1,600 meters above sea level, and it's hidden by mountains, very tall mountains, on all sides. The Dani are one of the most populous tribes in the highlands, and even though there had been a Dutch presence in Papua New Guinea since 1615, they did not make contact with that tribe until 1921, when Dutchman Captain Van Overeem ventured up into the mountains which surrounded the Baliem Valley. But he had very brief encounters with the people there, and they didn't make news throughout the rest of the world. In 1938, American biologist Richard Archbold was on an expedition, and he was flying over the Baliem Valley, which he believed would be empty since the very high mountains around it were considered to be uninhabited. So he was very surprised when he looked down from his plane and saw what appeared to be a well-thought-out, thriving society of roughly 50,000 people. They had created fields of sweet potatoes. They had dug irrigation canals. They'd built stone walls, planted gardens, created suspension bridges out of jungle vines. And they thought they were the only people on Earth. Archbold made contact with the Dani. He did some research, he spent some time there, snapped some pictures, and then he wrote about this experience in a 1941 article of National Geographic. Richard Archbold realized what the world had in the Dani people was a culture frozen in time, an inside look into how people had lived before the modern world. Men walked around completely naked, besides, placing gourds over their genital area. Women simply wore grass skirts and nothing else. They lived in thatch roof huts. They painted their faces. They donned elaborate headdresses. They fought each other with spears, and they believed in magic, shamans, and spirits. From the time they are born, the Dani people believe that they have a spirit inside of them, which we would, I suppose, call the soul. Most of their rituals involve keeping the restless ghosts of their dead happy, because if these ghosts are not placated, they can cause misfortune, illness, and even death amongst the living, especially if the person who had passed had been powerful in life. So it's a practice during the funeral of such a person for a relation, usually a woman, to cut off the tip of her finger in order to not only drive the spirit of the dead deep into the jungle and away from her village, but to also use the physical pain as an expression of sorrow, suffering, and loss. For a very, very, very long time, these people lived without any interference, but they were made known to the Western world after Richard Archbold wrote his article, and by 1954, Dutch missionaries had arrived and established a post in Wamena, and this is a little area in the Baliem Valley. It was obviously the goal of these missionaries to bring Christianity to the Dani as well as other tribes around Papua New Guinea, but to also be there at the urging of the Danish government to encourage these tribes to move away from practices that the Western world considered to be illicit and taboo, such as violent warfare amongst villages, polygamy, cannibalism, and headhunting. And we will talk about headhunting in more depth later on in this video, because it's a lot more complicated and a lot more in-depth than just to say people go and hunt heads and cut people's heads off and then bring them back as trophies. It goes way deeper. So let's leave the jungles for a moment, go back to the Western world and Robert Gardner, the Harvard filmmaker. So as far as he was concerned, the Dani people were the last great uncontacted civilization, and he was interested in their way of life, specifically their constant tensions and violent wars with neighboring peoples who were considered their enemies. Now keep in mind, this is not the Dani people fighting other tribes outside of their own. They're fighting each other, they're set up in villages, each village has an alliance with other villages, and then those alliances will battle each other. So Robert Gardner was like, well, is this how all people would be if we hadn't been civilized? You know, air quotes for those who aren't looking at me, civilized? According to the book Savage Harvest, which was written by Carl Hoffman, Gardner, quote, like most observers fascinated with indigenous people, felt they might offer insight into humans in an uncorrupted state. And he wanted to observe them and film them over months to glean insight into man's propensity for violence and war, end quote. And I really don't think that he had to do this, right? He didn't have to go into this uncontacted tribe to figure out what man's propensity for violence and war was. He basically just had to go and, maybe get a degree in history, because it's laid out there for you. From the beginning of time until now, man has quite the propensity for violence and war, probably always will. Now, the day-to-day of the Dani people were spent raising pigs and growing sweet potatoes. The more pigs you had, the more sweet potato fields you had, the more powerful and, wealthy and influential you were considered to be. But there were times of upheaval where they would need to fight, usually to avenge the death of one of their own. And according to American Anthropologist magazine, no leader of the tribe would become a leader without first proving himself in battle on the front lines, facing the spear of his enemy on an expanse of a grassy plain called No Man's Land.
Because the IK is small enough for men to cross easily in shallow places, this river portion of No Man's Land is extremely dangerous, and bands of warriors frequently use it as a means of entering their enemy's territory. Among the many birds that dwell near it, only ducks are avoided, it being supposed that they carry harmful magic fed them by the enemy downstream. Some men believe that to eat a duck would blind them to an approaching raiding party. Sometimes, though, their sudden flight serves as a warning that men are near. As is his custom, Wayak starts out for the frontier. He is armed and wearing the only clothing he knows, a dried and hollowed gourd, which tied up with a bark string gives him all the covering he desires. 2 wives stay behind in the long family house. Today, Wayak is especially alert because it is already 2 weeks since he and all the others of his group celebrated their killing of an enemy warrior. And because, according to the way these people live, that killing must be avenged. These people's wars and raids yield neither territory, prisoners, nor plunder. They fulfill the obligations of the living toward the slain, toward, in fact, the ghosts of the slain. Unavenged ghosts bring sickness, unhappiness, and possibly disaster. It is for this reason they go to war, and for the reason that they like to.
So what I want to quickly make clear, like I said, not all Dani people were allies. It's just a blanket term. Dani people is a blanket term used by outsiders to describe these people who lived in this area of the valley. So there would be alliances and groups formed within the Dani peoples, and each alliance is composed of several confederations, which are territorial units that contain anywhere from several hundred to up to 1,000 people. So based on where you were in the valley, this isn't a little valley, it's a huge valley, you know. When I think valley, I think like this cute little area between mountains, but it's a massive amount of space. So depending on where you were in the valley, you'd make alliances with your nearby neighbors and then fight other people who were in different territories. Now, at the time that Gardner was looking to make his documentary, inter-alliance warfare was running rampant in the Baliem Valley, and each alliance would be at war with one or more of their neighbors at any given time, and sometimes these wars would last for years, even a decade. Once the first person was killed, the war would go on, because although not all Dani people got along, they all believed in the same thing, that the ghosts of the murdered demanded revenge in the form of another death. So you can see how this would be a sort of never-ending cycle. So Robert Gardner made contact with N.G. Victor de Bruin, the head of Native Affairs in Dutch New Guinea, and he explained his intention to observe the Dani people and create a documentary about them. And de Bruin was all for it. He told Gardner that the government would help him make contact, and they would even help fund the project, contributing $5,000, which was a lot of money in the 60s. Now, there was a reason the Dutch government was so helpful to Gardner's project, but we'll get into that later. When Michael Rockefeller met Robert Gardner and heard about the project, he was super excited and he wanted to be a part of it, writing in his journal, quote, "It's the desire to do something adventurous at a time when frontiers, in the real sense of the word, are disappearing." End quote. So there's this like explorer sort of like impulse in us, in people, right? To go out and find new things. We get bored with our day-to-day. We get bored with the world we know, and we have to go out and find other things that nobody's ever discovered before. And what Michael's saying is, that's pretty much coming to an end, right? We've been exploring for hundreds of years. We've been finding new territories, new lands that weren't actually new to the people that lived there. And we're running out of space in the world. We're running out of unexplored space. And he wanted to, be a part of that history. He wanted to have his moment in that history. And trust me, he would. So Gardner brought Michael onto the project, which would later become a 1963 film titled Dead Birds. And Gardner gave Michael the job as a sound technician. And Michael had no real experience with being a sound technician, but Gardner could tell that he was eager, and he was maybe also hoping that the young Rockefeller's involvement might bring the project some attention and maybe even some further funding. So, in March of 1961, 23-year-old Michael Rockefeller flew from New York to Boston, then on to Tokyo, and from there he flew to Biak, an island off the north coast of New Guinea. There, he met Carl Heder, a Harvard anthropology graduate student who was also part of the documentary project, and the two young men boarded a transport aircraft that would take them to Hollandia, a port on the north coast of New Guinea. On April 2nd, 1961, Michael was flying over the Baliem Valley, and he was immediately transfixed, writing, quote, "The Baliem is a thing of magnificent vastness, decorated with the green of the valley floor and blues of the surrounding mountains. Tones are ever-changing in the shifting light. The mountains rise over 10,000 feet on all sides and are constantly hidden and altered by the clouds that gather about them. The valley floor is broken into fragments by the Baliem and its tributaries, hills and rocky rises, and the handmade barriers of the Ndani peoples. The climate is like Maine in the peak of summer, only the sun is better." End quote. He's so bougie, right? Like, he's so bougie. So to do research for these videos, I read the book Savage Harvest. I also read Mary Rockefeller's book. Her name's not Mary Rockefeller anymore, but she was Michael's twin sister, and she wrote a book about, sort of his disappearance, but also her life with him. what they did together as children. They were twins, so they were very close. And from Mary's book, I know that they spent summers in Maine. They had a, beautiful home there. And Michael Rockefeller, he wants to go out and explore like the wilderness, but he's also like super bougie at heart. And he's like, the summers remind me of Maine. It's nothing like Maine, right? Nothing. So once they landed, Michael and Carl met the rest of the team of the Dead Birds documentary, who had made their camp near a small stream in the Baliem Valley, close enough so that they could easily walk to the Dani villages, but far enough away so as not to be like intrusive, even though, the people knew they were there and they ended up being intrusive and distracting. Now, Robert Gardner had brought on many people of varying professional backgrounds, hoping to capture what they saw in the valley with several different mediums. So there was Peter Matheson, a writer the New York Times called a roving author and naturalist whose impassioned nonfiction explored the remote endangered wilds of the world. Also at the Riverside camp was Elliot Elsofan, a photographer for Life magazine, and Jan Broekhuis, an anthropologist. The men settled into their little camp. They pulled out their cameras and their sound equipment, their beer and their food, and they started discussing a plan of action for filming the documentary. And although they had not wanted to be intrusive, the people from the closest village did visit their camp. And they stared at the photography equipment and the Heineken because they were seeing these things for the first times in their lives. And they were just as fascinated by the strangers as the strangers were by them. To research these videos, I also went through Michael Rockefeller's own journals and letters and field notes, which have, been compiled, at least what has been published. I'm sure it's not everything that he wrote, and, there's reasons for that. But I will link to the place where you can find this stuff if you want to look at it yourself, because, like I said, I can't put everything in here, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in Michael Rockefeller's own writings. So the filmmakers observed daily life in the village, which included, allegedly, battles amongst warring villages. But some stuff came out after Michael's disappearance later, and according to a missionary who was stationed in the Baliem Valley at this time, it really wasn't as cut and dry as that, like these battles just happening while they happened to be there. The Reverend H.M. Lake would later claim that Gardner and his documentary film crew created a problem with the Dani people in the Baliem Valley during their time there. He said that, yes, it was true that the natives in the valley had been fighting each other for quite a while, but a little over a year before the Dead Birds film crew arrived, the Dutch government had put a stop to most of the violence that had been occurring. However, Gardner and his crew were there to specifically capture footage of the violence of the primitive man, and so they manufactured it. Reverend Lake would say, quote, "Our natives in our area reported that they offered the local chiefs chest shells and steel axes if they would resume fighting with traditional enemies. It was to get movies. They wanted movies of every phase possible of Dani life. Since no battles were going on, they wanted to start them again." End quote. Now, when asked why no one stopped Gardner and his crew from kind of doing this, Lake responded that Gardner had prior approval from The Hague in Holland to go into these uncontrolled areas, and he arrived with the backing of such high authority that no one could do anything about it. The Reverend Lake said, quote, "The members of the expedition denied it all to the government, but we have no doubt in our own minds." End quote. Now keep in mind, this is just one person's version of events. Other people, even other missionaries in the area, said different things, and there may have been a reason that the Reverend Lake made these claims, but we will get to that. Michael recorded the sound of everything, right? But he also began taking pictures as if he were a possessed man. Once or twice, Michael became so distracted with snapping photographs, sometimes 18 rolls of film a day, he forgot that he was there to do an actual job, which was to record sound. And when this happened, he was called out by the other men who were serious about the project, and he would sometimes walk away in tears, promising to be better. But the thing with Michael Rockefeller was he was very young and very new to being told what to do. The other men found him to be nice enough, usually very quiet, but also a bit immature and slightly spoiled. However, Michael did seem to have a knack for capturing the Dani people in a very special way. While the photographer from Life magazine posed the men in their battle attire and all their paint and glory and told them to look at the camera, Michael quietly snapped the inhabitants of the village in their natural state, appreciating the very real beauty of the day-to-day. He would later write to his friend Sam Putnam that what he had captured on film was so interesting, he was hoping to compile a book of photos to share this remote culture with the world. So after being told off a few times for not doing his job, Michael did get a little bit better, but Robert Gardner would later remark that Michael was still very easily distracted and disorganized, and it seemed as if he was there for a different reason than the rest of the crew. And as it turned out, he was. Michael was in Papua New Guinea on a dual mission of sorts. One night while they sat by the fire and Michael darned his socks, which basically means he's got holes in his socks and he's sewing them up, Michael told Carl Heder that his father, Nelson Rockefeller, had put him on the board of the Museum of Primitive Art. Carl Heder said, quote, Michael said he wanted to do something that hadn't been done before and bring a major collection to New York. End quote. Now, before he had left New York, Michael had been corresponding with a man named Adrian Gerbrands, an ethnologist living in New Guinea and the deputy director of the Dutch National Museum of Ethnology. Gerbrands had recently started doing field work with the Asmat people, another tribe in New Guinea. Now, when Michael heard about the Asmat, he was immediately certain that this was where he would find his major collection, which he could proudly bring home to his father, a collection that could possibly become the crown jewel of the primitive art exhibit. Now, if the Baliem Valley was a world away from Manhattan, the Asmat region was a world away from the valley. Not necessarily in distance, but in whatever understanding Michael had about those who lived very differently from himself. Now, Michael wanted to go there because very few people outside of the native population had visited, and the Asmat were known for their beautifully intricate woodwork. They are still considered to be the best woodcarvers of the Stone Age.
Sculpture has always been the Asmat's main activity. All the men can carve bowls, oars, or prows for their boats. Only a few ritual objects require a specialist because they are linked to the cult of the dead. These artists enjoy the prestige once reserved for the greatest headhunters.
The Asmat have the largest population of any tribe in Papua New Guinea, and they inhabit a coastal jungle area on the island's southwestern coast, bordering the Arafura Sea. Because of its location, with the sea to the south and high mountains to the north, this area is known to be highly inaccessible and unexplored. Author Carl Hoffman, in a Smithsonian Magazine article, said, quote, in many ways, the Asmat world at that time was a mirror image of every taboo of the West. In some areas, men had sex with each other. They occasionally shared wives. In bonding rituals, they sometimes drank one another's urine. They killed their neighbors, and they hunted human heads and ate human flesh. They weren't savages, however, but biologically modern men with all the brain power and manual dexterity necessary to fly a 747, with a language so complex it had 17 tenses, whose isolated universe of trees, ocean, river, and swamp constituted their whole experience. They were pure subsistence hunter-gatherers who lived in a world of spirits in the rattan and in the mangrove and sago trees, in the whirlpools, in their own fingers and noses. Every villager could see them, talk to them. There was their world, and there was the kingdom of ancestors across the seas, known as Safin, and an in-between world, and all were equally real. No death just happened. Even sickness came at the hand of the spirits because the spirits of the dead person were jealous of the living and wanted to linger and cause mischief. The Asmat lived in a world of extremes, of life and death, where one balanced the other. Only through elaborate sacred feasts and ceremonies and reciprocal violence could sickness and death be kept in check by appeasing and chasing those ancestors back to Safin, back to the land beyond the sea. End quote. Now, the reason that the Asmat were such skilled woodcarvers was because they believed that they themselves had come from wood, and we see this illustrated in one of their creation stories. This story, which would be passed down orally from generation to generation, tells the tale of Fumoripits, who the Asmat considered to be the first person to exist on Earth and also the first woodcarver. For a while, Fumoripits spent his day dancing on the beach, living his best life, eating fish, having a great time. But he became lonely, and eventually longed for companionship. So he chopped down some trees and he carved them into human beings, basically, carved them into human forms and placed them inside the U, which is a men's ceremonial house, very important in Asmat life and culture. Now, these unmoving wooden figures were not the friends that he had hoped they would be, so Fumerapits cut down another tree and made a drum, and he began to beat this drum, and as he beat his hands on the lizard skin stretched over the wooden drum, he watched in amazement as his wooden figures began to come to life, and they began to dance to his beat. But there is another story that Asmat youngsters grow up being told, because as much as the Asmat are known for their wood carving, they're also known for participating in a practice called headhunting. Because they believed that they were made from wood, the Asmat saw themselves as trees. And just as the fruit of the sago tree nourished new trees, the fruit of men would nourish other men. And the Asmat believed that the fruit of men were their heads. Now, we are able to have knowledge of this Asmat belief and practice through the Reverend Gerard Zegwaard, who was the first white man to visit the Asmat and live with them between 1952 and 1956. And he wrote all of this stuff down, and once again, I used that in my research for this video, his journals, his writings, his theses. And I will link that in the description box if you want to do further research for yourself. Now, Zegwaard claims that he was told this story by an elderly chieftain, and he was able to confirm it during his time with the Asmat. The story is about two brothers whose names I will never be able to pronounce more than once, so I'm just going to call the older brother Des and the younger brother Bu, because that's pretty much as far as I got in the pronunciation game. So older brother Des was sickly and weak, which left his younger brother Bu to have to go out and hunt in order to provide for them both. Now, one day, Bu came home, proudly holding a large pig, and in front of Des, he sliced the head of the pig off and then thrust a dagger through the pig's throat, pinning it to the ground in front of his older brother. But Des was not impressed, and he scoffed, and he was like, yeah, okay, you brought home the head of a pig. You know, it's easy enough to bring home the head of a pig, but the head of a man, now that would really be something. Now, Bu, the younger brother, he was not a fan of this idea. And the two brothers, they hadn't really ever seen any other people. So he asked his brother, how would I even get the head of a human? To which Des was like, good point. What about my head? And Bu took a hard pass on this idea, but Des pushed and prodded and argued with his younger brother so heatedly and for so long, Bu finally gave in and was like, fine, you want me to cut your head off so bad? Let's do this. So he severed his brother's head from his body completely. But once the head was separate from the body, older brother Des, he was still talking and giving his brother orders and instructions on what to do next. So Des taught Bu to properly butcher a human body, and I'm going to tell you this part directly from the writings of the Reverend Gerard Zegwaard. Quote, he was told to make a deep cut with a bamboo knife from the anus to the neck in such a manner that the cut went through one side of the trunk to the armpit and from there went by the collarbone to the throat. He was instructed to make a similar cut on the other side, but now from top to bottom. Through these openings, he had to break the ribs with a sharpened palmwood stick or with an axe. Then he put his hands underneath the chest, which could now be easily lifted and put aside. Arms and legs were first loosened, then cut off. Now, Bu took the entrails, as in a bundle, and removed them from the backbone with a vigorous jerk. Only the backside remained. The various parts, including the entrails, were placed in the fire and roasted. The upper part of the body and the arms were at once ready for consumption, but the lower part and the thighs had to be mixed with sago, a starch prepared from the pith of the sago palm, which had to be made in the form of long sticks, whereupon those two could be eaten. End quote. Zegwaard was told by the elderly chieftain that this, along with following steps, would then become an initiation rite for young Asmat men. Des was not just giving his instructions to Bu for the fun of it, he meant for Bu to go out and share this information with all future generations. Now, before a young man in the Asmat culture is initiated into manhood, he does not live with his family, but in a separate structure, which is the bachelor house, which is the U. And the U is, like I said, very important to Asmat culture. It's where the men gather. It's like a clubhouse. They talk about what's important in the villages, what's important in society. They, gossip probably. They talk about the politics of the day. It's like a clubhouse for men. And that's where all young men live before they're initiated into actual manhood. And then they can go and live with their families. So the men of the village will go out in their canoes on a mission of a headhunting raid, because it's believed that when someone dies, that death is caused by an enemy. And so they need to get a head to balance everything out. A life for a life, a head for a head. So when the men of the village are successful in their headhunting raid, they return in their canoes with this head from an enemy villager. And they're triumphant, right? And all the women and the older men of the village, they run out to the banks and they wait for these other men to come back. And when they see their canoes coming up the river, they start to cheer and sing and dance. Now, this head is going to be used to initiate a young man of the village. But first, an older brother of this new initiate needs to hold the head underwater. Then he takes the head and he runs with it to the bachelor house, while everyone else in the village follows, singing and blowing into bamboo horns. When the older brother arrives at the bachelor house with the head, he presents it to his younger brother by pinning the head to the floor near the fireplace, kind of like Bew did with the pig's head for his older brother Des. And the reason that they're doing this with the head is so that it can dry out a bit, right? Because it's a newly cut off head and it's kind of moist. The older brother then makes a mat, which he fills with magic twigs. And the younger brother, who's known as the initiate, he takes that mat, he walks out of the bachelor house, he goes to the canoes at the river, and he places the mat in the bottom of his family's canoe as if he's going to return the head to where it came from. But then he changes his mind, he takes the mat out of the canoe, someone pours water over his head, and then he returns to the bachelor house where he then assumes a pose of shame on the floor with his head lowered, not looking up or acknowledging anything or anyone around him. The initiate will remain in this pose of shame for several days while those around him attempt to get a reaction out of him, but he doesn't react because, quote, in this way he was to make it clear that he was going to be a determined, fearless warrior, end quote. So now the initiate's mother takes some hair from the decapitated head, she burns it into like an ash, she then mixes the ash with some blood from the head, and then she smears this mixture all over the head and shoulders of her son, the initiate. This is to be done the morning or afternoon after the raid. And then Zegward writes about a bunch of stuff like adornment, what the initiate should be wearing, ceremonial breastplates that need to be worn, specific body paint in specific places and specific patterns. But let's get back to the head, right? Because that's the important part for our contexts. And this head, he's just chilling by the fire right now, trying to get all dry. That evening, the head needs to be roasted and then stored in a loft overnight before being scalped in the morning. And then, quote, the next morning, the head was to be taken down from the loft and the nose skin was to be taken off first. Then the jaws had to be removed. The brothers of the initiate's mother worked in turns according to their age. While cutting and carving, they would comment on the victim's past actions. For example, while taking the skin off the mouth, one would say, yesterday this mouth ate fish on the bank of the river. Today it is dead. A cut had to then be made with a bamboo knife or a shell across the head from the root of the nose and the nape of the neck. Thus, the skin could be torn off in two pieces toward the ears. The jawbone had to be thrown outside, and those interested could take it. It was eagerly seized and used as an ornament on the breast of a boy or woman who had to participate in the initiation rite. The preparation of the head went on. It was held above the fire so that the flames touched the temple and the back. Then a hole was cut into it with the narrow side of a stone axe. The axe had been decorated and had to be named after the initiate. The brains were then shaken out through the hole and caught in a mat. About midnight, the brains mixed with sago, prepared in the form of long sticks, were eaten exclusively by the old men, end quote. So then the skull is decorated with ash, ochre, and chalk. They put some tassels on it, some beads on it, make it real pretty. And then the skull is placed between the open legs of the initiate, who is still in this pose of shame. All of this is happening per the instructions of the severed head of Des. Don't forget that. The head and the initiate need to stay this way for 2 or 3 days. And basically the initiate can't look up. He just has to stare at this skull that's all decorated the entire time. So then everyone in the village gets dressed up. Everyone gets into canoes, which have also been painted with ochre and chalk. The initiate gets into his family's canoe. The skull's placed at his feet at the bottom of the canoe. Then all the canoes and all the villagers move down the river, heading west towards the sea where the sun sets. As this is happening, the initiate is supposed to act like an old man who's getting older and weaker as the canoe progresses down the river until finally he can no longer stand and he collapses onto the bottom of the canoe. He's then lifted out of the canoe by his brothers and uncles, specifically his mother's brother. He and the skull are placed into the ocean, and then they're brought back into the canoe where all of his adornments are removed and placed into a magical mat. The initiate then has to take the skull and hang it around the neck of a woman in the village who gets this special role of being the recipient of the skull. At this time, all the villagers in their canoes begin to sing. They go back up the river in their canoes, at which point they stop and they go into the forest, which has been flooded by the tide. And just so you know, around this area, the forest is usually flooded by the tide. The tide goes up very high. It's very flooded, very swampy. And the people who live there, the Asmat, they sort of have adapted to this. It's very cool. So they go into this flooded forest. And they all have to look for crabs. But the initiate has to be very careful because if he accidentally breaks off the pincers of a crab, it could mean his own death. Now, during this phase, the initiate is no longer acting like an old man, but now he's acting like a newborn baby. He has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know where anything is. He doesn't know the names of rivers or tributaries. He doesn't know how to row a canoe. But as time goes on, and they're searching for these crabs, he learns these things. Now, when all of the people are finally back to the village, the initiate is allowed to leave the bachelor home, the U, and enter the home of his family. Never again to live in the U, but to go there often for meetings and men's hanging out and stuff. Like if foosball tables and pool tables existed in this village, that's where they would be kept, the U. So the initiate, who's now a man, he's adorned again. Some horns are blown. Everyone's happy, yay. But the ritual's not over. There's basically a big party. Everyone sings and dances until dawn. But get this is crazy to me. The initiate takes on the name and identity of the victim who was killed and beheaded for his initiation ritual. And not only that, Gerard Zegward, the missionary who lived with the Asmat people, he says, quote, "When meeting the initiate, even after many years, relatives of the murdered persons will always call him by his assumed name, the victim's name, and treat him as their relative. They dance and sing for him and give him presents. It is strictly forbidden to kill people from other villages who, because of their ritual names, are related to one's village. These people are often chosen to be negotiators. On my tours, I frequently hired them to be my guides to tribes hostile to their community. More than once, I witnessed persons with the adopted names of headhunting victims being enthusiastically welcomed by relatives of the victim." End quote. Crazy. So they've got all these different, rivalries, and the villages, they kill people, they kill each other, and they take their heads. But the headhunting is kind of also creating alliances at the same time. It's bizarre to me in the life we live in today that this would happen. But I can see, I suppose, how it would work. I can't believe I'm saying that. So we know what happens to the head of the victim, but what about the body? Zegward has an answer for that as well, saying, quote, "The flesh of the body is distributed at once after the butchering, according to the traditional scheme, among relatives and friends. After the return to the village, it is taken to their homes. Even the women and children get their share. The bones are for the dogs." End quote. Okay. So the Asmat people weren't cannibals because they just like to eat people or because they were hungry, which we know as far as history goes, sometimes societies and people would turn to cannibalism because of scarcity of food and things like that. That was not why the Asmat people did it. They did this for ritual purposes. And I guess the question right now would be, since the Asmat people are still alive and well living in Indonesia, do they still practice headhunting and cannibalism? That's kind of a tricky question. Officially, no. Officially. It's been reported that since the introduction of Christianity and the invasion of the white man, the instances of headhunting and cannibalism have gone way down.
Have you eaten human meat? Did it taste as good as pig? So he's eaten one man
One man,
and one woman.
one woman.
Is there any difference between the taste of a man and a woman? Did anyone ever eat a white man? Okay, so you've never seen a white man, so you didn't have the opportunity of eating a white man. That's fair enough.
But there are still reports that, yes, it does still happen because there are still Asmat people who follow the beliefs and the ways of their ancestors, similar to our videos we've done on South Africa in the past, and, you know, the different magical beliefs they have in South Africa that consist around, you know, human body parts and sacrifice and stuff like that. It's not like the common practice, but it does still happen. But we will talk more about this and the evidence that headhunting was certainly still happening amongst the Asmat people when young Michael Rockefeller showed up in their villages, waving around money and trying to buy objects that held far more value to them, the Asmat people, than he could have ever known. And that is where we will pick up in part 2 of this series. I promise you will want to hear what happens, so don't miss it. I've already written that part. I'm going to record it maybe right now so you don't have to wait long. Let me see what time it is. I do really have to edit this part. No, I'll record it tomorrow, but you'll have it within just a couple of days after this goes live. So don't worry, you won't have to wait long. I know this was a lot of you know, not so much action, but like the context, the building up, sort of setting the narrative, setting the scene. I know some of you don't like that, but I think that most of you do appreciate that and you understand why I do it, because it keeps me from having to kind of go back and explain while we're going through the actual story and the actual action why things are as serious and as grave as they are. So you don't want to miss it. Stay tuned for that. If you're kind of watching this far in the future, then I probably already linked it in the description box, so go right over there and check it out. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to follow me on social media. It's usually just Stephanie Harlowe or Steph Harlowe on Twitter and Instagram. I'm not on Twitter much lately because it's like a lot, man. But I do try to be on Instagram, although I have been very MIA on social media most of this month because I've been working so hard on this. But follow me there. Don't forget to check out my coffee company, Criminal Coffee Company, the best coffee ever, if I do say so myself, which I do loudly and proudly. So check that out. Link is in the description box. You don't have to pre-order anymore. We're shipping out on a regular basis, so you'll get your coffee very soon. And you can even sign up to have it just auto-shipped to you, like once a month or once every 2 months or whatever. Thank you so much for being here. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe. I missed you guys so much. I love you guys so much. And I will see you very, very soon. Bye.
Well, the levee don't break now, and the bottle's going straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood